Somewhere right now, someone is drowning. Not in water. In noise. Notifications. Group chats. Meetings that could have been an email. 1,000 tiny voices, all demanding a piece of you, all day, every day. Until there's nothing left of you to give. And here's the harsh truth nobody wants to say out loud. You are not tired because you're doing too much. You are tired because you are never, ever, alone. 2,000 years ago, a man who had access to the entire machinery of an empire, courts, senators, endless invitations, endless demands, made a decision that seemed, to everyone around him, like career suicide. He walked away. Not for a weekend. Not for a digital detox. He restructured his entire life around solitude, on purpose, as a discipline, the same way you'd train a muscle. Everyone around him had access to that same option. The same ability to simply close the door. Almost none of them took it. Because stepping back, when you're at the height of your influence, feels like losing ground. It feels like someone else will take your seat the moment you leave the room. That fear is exactly why so few people ever actually do it. And what he discovered in that silence didn't make him weaker or less relevant. It made him nearly untouchable. Not untouchable in the sense of being safe. History, as we'll see, had other plans for him. Untouchable in a different sense, untouchable in his own mind. Steady, no matter what the world outside was doing. Today we're going to sit with that decision. Not admire it from a distance, actually understand the mechanics of it. Because underneath this story is a mental tool that almost nobody uses correctly in the modern world. The strategic, deliberate art of disappearing. The man's name was Lucius Annaeus Seneca. By this point in his life, Seneca was arguably the second most powerful man in Rome. For years he had served as tutor, then advisor, then essentially co-ruler alongside a young emperor named Nero. He had wealth most senators could only dream of, vast estates, gardens, loans out to half the aristocracy. He had proximity to absolute power. He had, by every external measure, made it. Think about what that actually meant, day to day. Every morning, a line of clients and petitioners waiting at his door, each one wanting something, a favor, a word to the emperor, a loan, an introduction. Every evening, dinners where every sentence he spoke could be repeated, twisted, used against him by rivals circling for his position. There was no such thing as an unguarded moment. Not really. Every room he walked into, someone was watching, calculating, waiting. That is what real power costs. Not money. Attention. Every single hour of it, spoken for by someone else. But something in Rome had shifted. Nero, once a promising pupil, was drifting toward paranoia and cruelty. The political air in the capital had turned thick and dangerous, the kind of atmosphere where saying the wrong thing at a dinner party could cost you your life. Historians of the period, particularly the Roman senator and chronicler Tacitus, describe a court thick with suspicion, where old advisors were being quietly pushed aside or worse. People Seneca had known for years, men who had once dined at his table, who had once counted themselves his allies, were disappearing from public life in ways that had nothing to do with choice. Exile. Forced suicide. Quiet removal from favor. The machinery of the court had turned hungry, and it was no longer discriminating between friend and rival. Seneca could feel the walls closing in. He had spent enough years around Nero to read the shifts in him, the flattery that used to work no longer landing the same way, the silences that used to be comfortable now carrying a different weight. A man that close to power for that long develops an instinct for when the temperature in a room has changed. And by his own account in later writing, Seneca sensed that his usefulness to the emperor was thinning, and that a man who is no longer useful to someone like Nero is rarely allowed to simply retire in peace. According to Tacitus's account in the Annals, Seneca made a request to Nero. He asked to step back. He offered to return his fortune, his gardens, his estates, the very wealth that made him a target, and asked only for permission to withdraw from public life entirely, to spend what years he had left in study and reflection rather than in the palace. Now, we should be honest about the record here. Tacitus, like most ancient historians, reconstructed the substance of this conversation rather than transcribing it word for word. This was the convention of the time. But the outcome is well documented. Seneca did retreat from active political life in his final years, spending increasing time away from Rome and his country estates, deliberately narrowing the circle of people and obligations around him. Nero's response, according to the record, was measured. He refused to accept the return of Seneca's full fortune, but he allowed the withdrawal itself. Seneca began spending far less time in Rome and far more time at his country estates, deliberately shrinking the number of people who had access to his days. This wasn't retirement in the way we think of it. Seneca didn't stop working. If anything, this is when his most enduring writing was produced, the letters to Lucilius, dozens of them, written during this very period of intentional withdrawal. And in those letters, a theme returns again and again: the danger of crowds. In one of his letters, Seneca describes returning from a public gathering and noticing that he came back a little more restless, a little more aggressive, a little less himself than when he left. He wasn't talking about anything dramatic, no riot, no scandal. Just ordinary exposure to other people's noise, their opinions, their anxious energy. And he noticed how it seeped into him without his permission. His conclusion, paraphrased from his own writing, was blunt: spend too much time among the crowd, and you start absorbing its faults the way you'd catch an illness. Solitude, he argued, wasn't an escape from responsibility. It was maintenance. It was how a mind stayed sharp enough to be trusted with responsibility in the first place. In another passage, he describes something almost every person watching this has felt without naming it: the specific exhaustion of returning from a large gathering. Not physical tiredness. Something closer to contamination. As though you'd absorbed a dozen small anxieties that weren't yours to begin with, and now you have to spend the rest of the evening quietly setting them back down. He wasn't hiding from the world because he was weak. He was withdrawing because he understood something about the architecture of the human mind that most powerful people around him didn't. Constant exposure to other people's chaos eventually becomes your own. And notice, he didn't withdraw completely, forever, from all contact. That's an important distinction, because it's the one most people get wrong when they hear this story. He still had Lucilius, his correspondent, still had a handful of trusted friends, still engaged with the world through his writing. What he cut wasn't connection. What he cut was noise, the endless, low-grade, unchosen exposure to other people's anxieties that most Romans in his position simply accepted as the cost of relevance. A few years later, Seneca would be forced to take his own life on Nero's orders, accused, likely falsely, of conspiracy. It's a brutal ending to the story, and we won't pretend otherwise. But even in his final hours, according to Tacitus, he was calm, composed, and dictating final thoughts to those around him, comforting the people in the room rather than the other way around. The discipline of solitude he had built over years didn't save his life. Withdrawal was never a shield against fate. Seneca himself would have been the first to say so. But it shaped how he faced its end. A mind that had spent years practicing steadiness in quiet moments had something to draw on when the loudest, most terrifying moment of his life finally arrived. That's the part worth sitting with. Not that solitude protects you from hardship. It doesn't. But it builds the only thing that actually helps when hardship shows up anyway, a mind that already knows how to be alone with itself, and isn't afraid of what it finds there. Here's what's really going on underneath this story, psychologically. Modern psychology has a name for what Seneca was describing almost 2,000 years before it had a name: emotional contagion. It's the well-documented tendency for humans to unconsciously absorb the moods, stress levels, and mental states of the people around them. You don't have to talk to someone anxious to become a little more anxious yourself. Proximity alone does most of the work. Now scale that up to what we live in today. We are not just physically surrounded by people the way Seneca was in the Senate or at a Roman dinner party. We are constantly digitally surrounded. Every scroll is an exposure to someone else's outrage, someone else's highlight reel, someone else's fear. And unlike Seneca, most of us never step back long enough to notice what it's doing to us, because we've mistaken constant connection for connection that matters. Seneca had to physically walk into a crowded room to catch its anxiety. You carry that crowded room in your pocket. It's in your hand at breakfast. It's the last thing you look at before sleep. There has never, in the history of the species, been a version of a human being this saturated in other people's unfiltered emotional states, and almost no one alive has been taught how to manage that exposure. We inherited the crowd Seneca was warning about, and multiplied it by a few billion, and handed it to every person on the planet before they turned 13. This is the trap. Modern culture treats visibility as success. Being everywhere, replying instantly, never missing a moment, that's held up as ambition. But what Seneca understood, and what a lot of high-performing people rediscover the hard way, is that unmanaged exposure to other people's noise is not neutral. It has a cost. It erodes your judgment before you even notice it's gone. Consider what actually happens, mechanically, when you spend an hour scrolling through other people's opinions, outrage, and curated success. You don't just consume information. You absorb a mood. Your baseline shifts, usually toward comparison, toward urgency, toward a low hum of inadequacy you can't quite trace back to its source. By the time you sit down to do the one thing that actually matters, the work, the decision, the conversation you've been avoiding, you're doing it with a mind that's already been quietly hijacked by 100 strangers' anxieties. Solitude, done right, isn't loneliness. It isn't avoidance. It's a recovery mechanism, the mental equivalent of letting a muscle rest so it can actually get stronger instead of just getting more worn down. And here's the part that connects directly to success, wealth, and clarity: the sharpest decisions, the ones that build fortunes, save relationships, or change the direction of a life, are almost never made in the middle of the noise. They're made in the quiet after it. Seneca didn't lose relevance by stepping back from Rome's chaos. He produced his most lasting work because he stepped back. Think about the founders, the writers, the strategists you actually admire, the ones whose work has held up over time. Almost without exception, their defining ideas didn't arrive in a meeting or on a group call. They arrived on a walk, alone. In the shower. At 3 in the morning, when the noise had finally gone quiet. That's not a coincidence. That's the mind doing what it was always built to do, once you stop feeding it interruptions. Disappearing, strategically, isn't quitting on the world. It's how you come back to it with something worth saying. So how do you actually build this into a life that isn't set in ancient Rome, a life with a job, a phone, and people who expect a reply within the hour? Here are 4 ways to practice strategic isolation, the way Seneca actually practiced it. Step 1. Schedule your withdrawal before you need it. Seneca didn't wait until he was breaking down to retreat to his villa. He built the rhythm in advance. Pick a fixed block. It doesn't need to be a weekend, it can be 40 minutes, where you are fully unreachable. Phone in another room. No messages in, no messages out. The point isn't the length. The point is that it's scheduled, not reactive. Put it on the calendar the same way you'd put in a meeting. Treat it with the same seriousness you'd treat an obligation to someone else, because that's exactly what it is, an obligation to the version of you that has to make decisions tomorrow with a clear head. If 40 minutes feels indulgent, start with 15. The size of the block matters far less than the consistency of it. A withdrawal you plan for is discipline. A withdrawal you're forced into by burnout is damage control. One builds a mind that stays sharp. The other is just a mind trying to recover after it's already broken. Step 2. Audit your daily crowd exposure. At the end of each day, ask yourself one honest question: what did I let into my head today that I didn't choose? News feeds you scrolled out of habit. Conversations you didn't need to have. Opinions you absorbed without examining them. You're not trying to eliminate all of it, that's not realistic. You're trying to become aware of it, the same way Seneca noticed he came back from gatherings a little worse than he left. Awareness is the first form of control. Try this literally, tonight. Take 30 seconds before bed and mentally scroll back through your day, not for what you accomplished, but for what you absorbed. Was there a moment where your mood shifted after reading something you didn't need to read? Notice it, name it, and let it go. You're not trying to fix your entire information diet in one sitting. You're training the muscle that eventually lets you catch it in the moment, before it takes hold, which is the actual goal. Step 3. Protect one relationship with real depth over 10 with none. Seneca's letters were written to one man, Lucilius. Not a crowd. Not an audience. One person, engaged with seriously, over years. In practice, this means resisting the pull to spread your attention across every acquaintance and platform, and instead investing real time in the few relationships that actually sharpen you. Look at your week honestly. How much of your social energy goes toward maintaining dozens of shallow connections, versus deepening the 2 or 3 that actually make you think, that actually challenge you, that you'd trust with a real problem? Pick one of those relationships this week and give it real, undistracted time, a long conversation, a real letter, a call with no phone in your other hand. Solitude isn't the enemy of connection. Shallow, constant connection is. Step 4. Use the silence to write, not just to rest. This is the part people miss. Seneca's withdrawal wasn't passive. He didn't retreat to do nothing, he retreated to produce his clearest thinking. When you carve out your solitude, bring a notebook. Write down the thought you've been avoiding, the decision you've been putting off, the honest answer to a question you keep dodging in public. You don't need a perfect system for this. 3 questions are enough to start. What am I avoiding right now? What would I do here if no one were watching or judging me for it? And what's one honest sentence I haven't said out loud to anyone? Write the answers down, even messily. The act of putting a private thought into words is what separates rest from reflection. Solitude without reflection is just isolation. Solitude with reflection is where clarity actually gets built. None of these require you to abandon your career, your family, or your responsibilities. Seneca didn't abandon his either. He restructured how he engaged with the world so that the world stopped dictating the state of his mind. That's the whole discipline. In one sentence, you don't owe your attention to every voice that demands it. Seneca knew something that took him a lifetime of proximity to power to fully understand. The crowd will always be loud. It will always demand more of you than it deserves. And if you let it, it will slowly replace your voice with its own. The people who actually change something, who build the thing, who write the letter that outlasts them, who face the end with steadiness instead of panic, they're not the ones who were available to everyone, all the time. They're the ones who knew when to disappear. Not permanently. Not out of fear. But deliberately, on purpose, the way you'd close a door before an important conversation with yourself. Seneca lost his life to a court that never learned this lesson, a court so consumed by noise, suspicion, and the constant hum of other people's fear that it eventually turned on itself. He, at least, had built something the noise couldn't touch. A mind that had practiced being alone long enough to trust what it found there. So ask yourself, tonight, when was the last time you were truly, deliberately alone with your own thoughts, not scrolling, not distracted, just present with yourself? If you can't remember, that's your answer. If this kind of thinking helps you see things more clearly, subscribe. There's a lot more of this ancient wisdom waiting, and we're just getting started.